Hey everyone, Jay from the future here. I recorded this video, and while I'm going back and editing it, I realized that there isn't really a flow to the video. There's no structure, so if you like stuff off a script, or not just the mad ramblings of somebody who enjoys some part of a hobby, then this might not be the video for you, but there's some mad chats in here talking about Tau and Lumineth Realm Lords and some of the differences between and everything. So just wanted to let you know in advance, this isn't a strictly structured video. This isn't, about hyper-competitive stuff, which is usually the theme of a lot of my videos. This is just a nerd talking about some of the stuff that he likes in a new game system and seeing some overlap with his current favorite factions. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Regardless, more Tau content is going to be coming, as well as some more AOS stuff as I dive further into Lumineth Realm Lords. But yeah, hopefully you enjoy. Hello everybody, this one is going to be a slightly different one as we are going to be left turning from 40k onto a little bit of a side project, Age of Sigmar. Now, what? You say, hello everybody, hello. Wish you could have a kiss? Oh, thank you. So Age of Sigmar is something that at first I really had no idea about when I was getting into 40k, because my journey only really started about a year and what are we coming up on? A year and 9 months now? And, learning the game, doing everything from scratch and then moving into competitive play very, very quickly. I had a little bit of exposure to Warhammer when I was a kid. Unfortunately, because I grew up in an incredibly conservative Christian household, everything was the devil. Everything to do with Warhammer. I had a lot of friends that were into it, and I was allowed to collect one army and one army only from both fantasy and from 40k. Fantasy, it was Bretonnia, because it was knights, it was peasants, it was nothing that was the devil, because elves, dwarves, orcs, everything was the devil invading our home. And then I was allowed to, from 40k, collect Imperial Guard, because it was just tanks and it was just soldiers and just to quote Adeptus Ridiculous, just regular guys. Just guys out there doing their thing. And none of that was the devil. Now, when I was getting back into 40k, I started to have a couple of my interests reignited. When I was a kid, I was always more interested in fantasy than 40k. The futuristic stuff never really grabbed me. And I was kind of disappointed to learn that fantasy had gone away. Now, obviously, we've had reveals that fantasy is coming back. I don't know how competitive that will be. And that will be a big determining factor for me, is whether I get into a game with the limited, money and time and everything that I have. I need to know that there is going to be a competitive scene, or it's at least balanced competitively, that I can go and play tournaments and everything else, because that's what I love from the game. Casual play is all good and well, but I kind of need to have that competitive edge and being able to go and have a good, sort of social time while also competing for something. So then I got pointed towards AOS by all the guys that I was asking questions of in the 40k group that I joined. And I'm not going to lie, it didn't grab me. And that's because you have Stormcast Eternals, which are Space Marines, but with hammers and shields. And you had none of the really, really iconic named factions that I remembered. The Orcs I didn't recognize at all, because it was Uruk War clans and Cruel Boys, and a couple of those I'm like, oh, they sound like Orc clans, so that's fine, but there was no Orcs and Goblins that fed into. And then you had, I was trying to look for some of the what are now Order factions that I remembered, and I'm like, there's no Lizardmen, there's no Empire, there's no Bretonnia, there's no High Elves and Dark Elves and whatever else. And I saw Daughters of Cain, and I'm like, okay, that's sort of there. And as I was sort of looking into it, I was a little bit dejected, because it felt like there had been a lot of the stuff that really made me love fantasy in the first place had kind of been ripped out from it. And it was this almost like a clean slate, and we're going to put in a bunch of stuff that just felt very, as an outsider who had very, very strong memories of the fantasy world, it felt kind of generic.
Whoa, hey.
And then over time, as I just kept looking at little bits and pieces, could you stop eating my foot, boy? Sorry about that. Over time, as I started to get familiar with the names, I'm like, okay, Lizardman, Seraphon, and, the giants are sons of Behemat, and, all these different things. And then I came across the faction that I had always wanted to collect when I was a kid, and that was Lumineth Realm Lords, which were High Elves. Now, as I was going through the range, I was really, really disappointed that I wasn't going to get that fantasy experience of, the White Lions of Trace and all of their different really, really cool wizards from the Tower of Hoeth, and the Swords Masters that protected them, the Dragon Princes, literal dragons to ride. That, I think, is probably the biggest thing. That's something that I look at Stormcast Eternals and I feel incredibly jealous, because there is a list that you can run, and I don't think it's particularly competitive anymore. From what bits I've been reading, it was super competitive once upon a time, and it's fallen off a lot from points adjustments or something. But they can have an all-Dragon Rider list, which I thought was really, really cool. Playing through, Total Warhammer 2 or 3, where they released Imric, the Dragon Rider or the Dragon Lord or whatever he is. That was really, really cool. That was some of the stuff that I was wanting to get into. But doing as we did with the Tau Index, and now we do with Age of Sigmar, just accepting what we can't change and trying to look at what's there and what's awesome. And one of the first things that stood out to me was Teclis. And he has a much, much bigger model. Now, I haven't been able to afford him yet. I've had a couple of very, very key things. I had one of my amazing patrons use one of their voucher codes rather than get something for themselves. They bought me a Lumineth Vanguard box out of nowhere, which was incredible. So I've had bits and pieces, but not that big boy. I've really got to put some money away to be able to afford that. So, but the model looks incredible. I always loved Teclis and Tyrion. When I was a kid, I remember reading books about Tyrion and just thinking, this is one of the coolest characters I think I've ever seen. And I don't remember the exact story, but there was, I think it was the Sword of Cain that he had, or one of his swords that, he had to take, and then, there was this self-sacrifice of, I'm butchering the story, but there was a really, really great story. I think it was in a White Dwarf or something that I got when I was a kid that just sold me on those two as these, up-and-coming leaders of the High Elf race. And Tyrion, obviously, is gone, or not really. I think he's the god of war for the Lumineth, but he's not really something you can play. Teclis is the god of magic, but he is something you can put on the table. And I was really, really lucky to have a friend from the 40k circuit, had a friend that plays AOS, because this guy is an uber nerd. He loves playing every system he can get his hands on. And he had a friend that was like, well, I've got a Lumineth army sitting around. I'm probably going to look at selling it. I'm not using it at the moment. Does he want to borrow it? Which I thought was incredible. I had this dude just give me like $3,000 worth of models or something for me to just play at my will. And obviously didn't take it to any tournaments or anything. I, very, very heavily respected that it was his property. So everything was in the house. I bought bits and pieces of it from him, but as I was playing it, and this is kind of the point of this video, I had something dawn on me. And I was just kind of like, oh my God. I picked Fantasy Tau. Now, let's talk about why that is. Because Lumineth is something that I haven't been able to find a lot of content creation on. And it seems to be a faction that, like Tau, gets hated on a little bit by the AOS community. And I can see why. One of the most dominant builds that they have been using, one of the only builds really that was functional outside of an Alarith Stoneguard list, was like 40 archers, Teclis in the center, comboing a bunch of stuff, and having them cast their spell, which allows them to do mortal wounds on 5s to hit. Running it in the Helon subfaction, which recently got changed, but before the change, when I was looking at all this stuff, was shooting at something that was within, I think, 6 inches of you or 9 inches of you, one of the two. You got an extra attack, which was huge. And so what you would do is essentially shoot all of these shots, which weren't really anything from a stat line perspective. They're not that great. But when you look at that, out of, the shots that you were doing, you would get through, maybe 10 mortal wounds onto, and then they would have to roll saves, and sometimes weight of dice is something that we force people into having stuff die that maybe shouldn't. Because AOS, I've noticed, and this is one of the big things, getting into this, and I'll do another video about, you know, the things that I, as a highly ranked 40k player, are having to do to transition into the AOS system. And not to say transition as in I'm leaving 40k, but the things that I have to do when I'm in a game of AOS that either conflict with what I know about 40k, things that help me from 40k to win games of AOS. And I have had a pretty good run. And the friend that I'm playing against is quite good. And he's been bringing some, let's call it tanky and obnoxious stuff. But I noticed that, you know, as I'm sort of going through and playing this list, I was just doing Tau things because, you know, I didn't play in 8th where our big thing was castling. But what I did sort of learn, because I'm a nerd that learns everything, so even if I didn't play it myself, I knew what the meta was getting into it before we got our 9th book, was that everybody was just castling because of the Overwatch rule that we had. And then I found myself castling with this army. Now, there is a bit of speed in this army, as there are, you know, Wind Riders and that sort of stuff, and there's a spell that you can get off very easily, might I add, to double their movement speed, and then you can do some awesome stuff with them where you charge, but then you don't have to pile in towards the unit. You can pile in any direction that you want. So there was some really obnoxious move blocking stuff that I was able to do with that, even though I was brand new to this system. The fundamentals of 40k fell over into that quite a lot. And then a few other things started to dawn on me that, you know, this army that I was playing, well, obviously it was this list. So the things I'm going to go through that sort of made me have this realization, obviously it's not exhaustive. And obviously there are a few... That's my puppy teeing off again. I apologize. Obviously, there are more nuances and there are hedge cases and there are everything else that make it so that what I am saying is a little bit for just, you know, like comedic purposes, a little bit being hyperbolic, but just a few realizations about the list I was running, the playstyle I felt I was being forced into. I saw a lot of that crossover. So let's go through what they were, and then I'll talk about some of the things that I think I'm going to have to adjust to as a Tau player looking at this faction, because I'll be honest, I was more looking for, and there is a lot of magic in Lumineth Realm Lords, and that's great. I love magic in 40k. The first army that I actually looked into was Grey Knights, because I loved the idea of Psychic, and everything that I could read online was that they were just, you know, these amazing Psychers. All of them are, they're anti-Psychic, they're blah, 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 and I'm like, that's cool. I get them, and then I'm like, all of their Psychic sucks. And then there's Eldari and Tyranids doing their things, and obviously this was 9th, not talking about 10th. But yeah, so there's a lot of magic, but I feel like this is another army where I'm operating really in 2 phases of the game. Maybe 3 if you count the movement phase, which I do for Tau, but yeah, so let's get into talking about some of that stuff. Now, the first thing that I really want to talk about with Lumineth Realm Lords is, as a faction, when I was looking at them, they resonated with me a lot. Not only because there is remnants of the high elf sort of thing, like, you look at, the models are actually really, really cool. Like, the horses aren't actually horses, they're kind of like a weird dragon velociraptor, which I think is really, really awesome. And obviously this is the guy that I bought from. These are his undercoats. I'm going to have to undo the gold. But the sculpts are actually very, very cool. They have a very clean aesthetic, which is something that I normally go for. You know, in any of the armies that I play, I've gone for, you know, Votann, Tau, Grey Knights, and, you know, looking at, because I love, again, my elves, so looking at Eldari, but not probably going to touch them or go down that route until they're fixed and not dominating the meta so heavily. And then when I'm looking at this, there were so many other factions that just didn't appeal to me because they were all edgy spikes and, you know, bunch of, like, I generally tend to like a really clean aesthetic. Don't get me wrong, I'll lean into the chaos every now and again, but that's more my style. So some of the sculpts are amazing. Teclis's model is, well, it can be polarizing for some people, but I do love that he has just this big spirit, what's the creature that it is? Felina, Spirit of Fish. You know what? It's actually not going to be easy for me to find it, but it kind of reminds me of, like, griffins or hippogriffs, or just those creatures that are kind of a mix of different things, even though he's classed as an elemental or elemental because GW has to make them legally distinct so they can copyright all of it. But anyway, I really do think that they have some incredible models. And it turns out, Techless, as I was going into it, absolutely slaps. But having said that, most of what we're doing is still shooting. Now, I did have the benefit of being able to proxy some of the things that I didn't have, so I got the Umbral Spell Portal, which I saw a bunch of people using, and wanting to find out exactly why they would do it, worked out very, very quickly why Lumineth players would launch this thing and then have Techless throw, 2 of his big nukes through it, 2 buff spells on everybody, and, whatever else I could come up with to do to his army. So when I look at Lumineth, unfortunately, it also shares something that we've found with the Tau Index from 10th, that it has very, very poor internal synergy and generally very poor internal balance. Now, the reason I say that is because for the most part, for the life of the Codex, so far as I've been able to see, or the Battle Tome, sorry AOS fans, I'll probably do that a lot, forgive me, but really a lot of lists have been hinging on either... Well, one of 3 sub-factions out of the 6 or 7 or whatever that they've got. And one of the 3 is actually much less popular before Helon got changed. So a lot of lists in the lead up to me talking about this and the change to Helon were running Helon as a sub-faction, which is the extra attack, or you were running Immetrica, which is basically your cow people. I don't know where the cow people came. I think it's because it's like elementals and shaping the earth and whatever. But they do look really, really cool. Like the big war cows actually kind of look cool because they got mountains growing out of their back. They got these big ass hammers. There's a named one of them. And you were running that in your Metrica because you could put on your Stone Guard units. The army rule was that anything with a -1, you ignore -1 rend, so you have to have -2 for them not to take it on their armor save. And if they were a Stone Guard unit, you ignore rend 1 and 2. And so that was relatively powerful. One of the downsides of it was that the Stone Guard units were very, very, very slow. Stone Guard, I think, moved like... Hang on, I'm going to get the battle tome. Hang on. Yes, so I checked my... They're called Great Nations, the sub-factions. Ymetrica, ignore Rend 1 and 2, which is pretty cool. And then you get into the Stone Guard. Now, one of the things that kind of makes that list a little bit polarizing, and why I say there's not a lot of internal synergy within the book, is that ability to ignore Rend 1 and 2... or Rend 1 for any of your other Ymetrica units, must have a specific ability. And if they don't have it on their data sheet, then they get no benefit from that Great Nation. Even though, and it's weird that they have classed them, and this is one of the things that I found that when I was collecting High Elves as a kid, obviously I didn't have an adult mind, I wasn't playing competitively, I wasn't whatever, but everybody in the High Elf Nation would interact with one another. The Great Nations genuinely seem to be that this Great Nation is great with subset of unit. This Great Nation is great with this subset of unit. And any of the Great Nations, you could take everything in and give them a bonus, kind of suck. Or maybe not suck, but they're lackluster in comparison to the things that everybody is taking because they give you a very tangible power increase. Now, this is something that I am keen to play around with a little bit more, keen to get to list building, and, I've been reviewing metastats for, quite a while. And it was good to see that there was actually somebody who ran a Battle Cow list with Techless and everything else, and went undefeated at a tournament very, very recently. That was cool. But there are a lot of things that, like Zytrek is the other one. So you had Ymetrica, Helon, and Zytrek were the 3 most popular Great Nations, because Zytrek gives you a very, very tangible bonus to almost your entire army because every unit has a wizard in them with an asterisk. I don't know if there are some that don't, but most of them will have a wizard as like the leader, the sergeant, the chasvreux, if you will. Now, if you're going Zytrek, you just get a flat add 1 to any casting, dispelling, or unbinding. For anybody who's coming from 40k and listening to this and wondering about AOS, the difference between unbinding and dispelling I always get these fucking mixed up, and I'm trying to rote learn this as best I can. But unbinding is very, very similar to deny the witch tests. So somebody else is casting a spell, you are trying to stop that spell going off. And unbinding is where there is a class of magic in the game called endless spells. You put it down and it has a persistent effect that other people can try and unbind on their turn, or on yours in receipt to it. I'll have to double check all that stuff. But basically you put an effect down, like say like the burning head is this big laughing, cackling, flaming head that goes across the thing and it does mortal wounds. I was doing a Pac-Man thing, but just, imagine flaming head. So, that is a different sort of class of magic because it's not an instant effect. It is an endless spell. And some of them will move on their own. Some of them have an effect that you put them down and they're just there. Lumineth Realm Lords, one of their endless spells, is actually one of my favorite spells ever. It's called Rune of Petrification. And everybody within a certain range of it has to take a check. They potentially take mortal wounds and have their movement halved. I don't think it affects charges. It might. I'll double check that. But really, really great endless spell. After playing with it for a little bit, really great endless spell. So getting a +1 to all of those things is fantastic. Then you start looking at some of the other great nations. And you can see where things become lackluster, even though on paper they don't seem terrible, but they don't translate into competitive environments well. So, goddamn, this has just become a Lumineth Realm Lords review, not like comparisons between them and Tau. But I promise I'm getting to it. At its core, this is an AOS video. If you've just jumped in because you want to see a real quick, like, this is Tau versus Lumineth Realm Lords, here it is. Everybody seems to hate them. They're predominantly shooting and operating very, very few phases of the game. What were my other points? They tend to be very, very fragile and brittle and easy to take down. Glass cannony would be something that you could really call them. And the current iteration of their rules is very, very internally unbalanced and non-synergistic. So if that's what you were coming for, just to see what they were and you don't need any extra explanations, thanks for coming. Check out my Patreon and my YouTube members. Everybody else, let's keep going with it. So I look at something like Iliatha. And this is that you can say that 2 friendly units will use their Aether Quartz reserve ability rather than 1. Now that's not terrible, but that's something that I can get around playing as a decent player. Now what do our Aether Quartz do? It is a token that every single unit starts the battle with. When they use it, you can... it's been a while since I've played my stuff. So you can use their Aether Quartz reserve. When you do, you immediately take a -1 to your bravery. So it means that you are more likely to fail morale checks. And in AOS, morale checks are very, very similar to how 9th morale checks were. Only more devastating. Because there are generally bigger units, you will have more people run on average, because I think it's the difference between what you roll plus the number of models you lost as opposed to your bravery. So the number in between is how many models you lose, which can be a lot. So when you do it, you can either get a +1 to your save rolls. Now this one is good, but generally speaking, there's a lot of ways to get +1 to your save, and you can never get more than +1. So it's good if you're in the open or you don't have, like, you're in melee and there's no way that you could have gotten this otherwise. It can be nice. You can add ones to hit roll, which is actually really good if you've got a unit that you definitely need to kill. And then the other one that you can do is, so after you've attempted to cast a spell, but before anybody tries to unbind it. So this, basically you get to roll for a spell, see if it goes off, and before your opponent tries to deny it, you get to either add 1 to the casting roll or re-roll the casting roll. Now, that is actually fantastic. I think that's probably been the thing that I have used my Aether Quartz the most for. And there's a unit that actually does synergize really, really well with Aether Quartz called the Sonari Cathala. She, when somebody uses their Aether Quartz within a certain range of her, she absorbs that. They don't take the -1 to bravery. And she puts that -1 bravery onto a unit she can see from your enemy's army within a certain range. So that's where, you're seeing this unit pop up a lot because there is that internal synergy. but there's not a lot in the rest of the book. But anyway, so you look at that, oh, I can use my Aether Quartz twice in a phase, because normally it's capped at 1 unit per phase. But that's not really as powerful as you're charging me, I'm going to shoot you with 1 extra attack. And yeah, so you can see where like the Great Nations really, there's only a handful of options. So what I've found is there are a handful of options, and the most dominant one was Techless, a shitload of archers, a distraction unit of Wind Riders, a unit of the Wardens, which are the Spearmen, the basic battle line infantry, and then supporting characters. Just little dudes, because the edition that they were in, the General's Handbook, was really, really geared around non-mounted characters with less than a certain threshold of wounds, which Techless could not be. So then the other thing that I found is that these guys, which this really made me, especially playing against my friend who brought stuff that was very, very sturdy, was very hard to get through. They're very brittle. They're very glass cannon, and they're really only glass cannon at range, because there's not a lot of units in this book that will slap in melee. There's like 1 character, and there is 1 unit which is I believe the Blade Lords can be good, but having said that, they're so brittle that getting them into combat is much, much harder than you would ever want it to be. Now, if they had something where you had a teleport spell where you could get in for a decent range charge, like I think about the AOS list that I started on first was actually, the army was actually Skaven. Skaven have been something that have been this weird love-hate relationship ever since I was a kid. I love the Skaven, but there is something about them that is just not normally what I would go for. And learning all of their rules, I found out that I was actually kind of playing the wrong faction as a brand new player, because Skaven requires thinking that I just do not have. At least with my level of knowledge of the game so far, to get them to work, the people that do well with them understand the game inside and out and think differently to a lot of other people, because their units are just like, they die to a sneeze. You just need to know their tricks to get the value before they go out. And everybody that I was going with this, like even the shield-wielding Wardens are on a 4-up save with 1 wound. And I looked at that and I was like, really? Really? And then I go up against some of my friend's stuff, and he was on 2s and 3s for most of his army, with other effects that he would have, like army rules or the ability to ignore certain rend, or -1 to wound, or whatever the effects might have been. And really all I got was that one of the good things about the units is that you have -1 to hit, which was very reminiscent of Tau, because a lot of our stuff now has stealth, but when all of their bases are touching. When a unit sits like that, it's called, Shining Company, which a lot of the units have, which is really fantastic. So they're -1 to hit, which is good, but then they're on a 4-up save, which means a lot of them will die a lot of the time. Now, you can pop their Aether Quartz and go to a 3-up, but I'll be honest, for a once-off that reduces your bravery, I actually would have hoped that they were on a 3-up going to a 2-up, because AOS is less killy than 40k is, though that's not always true, because 10th was supposed to be less killy, and you look at Eldari and everything else at the moment, the best armies in AOS seem to use things that have decent damage and rend and all that sort of stuff. Rend for my 40k players is AP. So all of their stuff dies to a stiff breeze very, very, very easily. The only thing really that doesn't is Techless, and the reason why he's a centerpiece for so many people is because he's got a spell. Now, Techless can cast 4 spells and they just go off on a 10 for every single one. You can try and unbind them, but if he needs just the 1, he can do an undispellable cast for 12. He can do 2 for a dispellable cast of 12, or he can do 4 for a dispellable cast of 10. And he's got an ability that gives everything within a certain range of him a 5-up Feel No Pain until the start of your next hero phase. Command phase for 40k players. And that can go a very, very long way. But having said that, it means you've got to take this over 700 point unit to be able to facilitate it. And you want to damn sure make sure you go first, or that you've deployed in a way that the enemy can't get to you and shoot you or magic you turn 1. Because if you don't go, you don't have that Feel No Pain. It's in your hero phase, and yeah. Knights players will know that pain from ninth, where they couldn't bondsman if somebody else went first. And that's how I won a lot of my games against them on Tau, because I would just railgun, railgun, railgun. Most of your little boys are dead. Cool, let's go get a beer. So then I look at the internal balance, and I think this is what I was saying before, that the great nations, there are some like Metrica wants stone mages and wants the stone guard and wants the big battle cows. And then you've got, Helon was really, really synergizing with the Huracan Wind Mage and the named characters, or the anime protagonists that are up shooting down into a tornado, and that was your archers that you were taking. But then you have things like, you want to take some Dawn Riders, your basic cavalry unit, which don't get an army rule, which seems really, really, really odd. And I think that's where a lot of people have had a problem with the Lumineth Realm Lord Battletome, because it doesn't have a lot of that synergy, and you're relying on stuff that makes your opponent hate you. Like the Sentinels, you've got two 20-man bricks firing 20 shots each, and in the hero phase, the wizard of the unit casts Power of Hish, which their weapons, just at base, Sun Metal weapons, which Sun Metal weapons they have all the time, they have 6s turn into mortal wounds. Very, very similar to 6s explode. In terms of having to get through, explodes, you then have to get through the wound roll and the save roll. Mortal wounds just go straight through. Kind of works out to being about the same. Though these are damage 1 shots, that's very, very common for AOS. So you've got this unit that's sitting, and if you're shooting them lofted, you're 24 inches, but I believe there's a way to make them shoot further. Yes. So if you're within 12 inches of another unit of Sentinels, which usually you will be, and this isn't wholly within, this is just within, you add 6 inches to your shot. So you're shooting them at 30 inches, which, Tau players, that was what our plasma rifles were, and they were fantastic in 9th. So you're shooting them at 30 inches, doing a bunch of mortal wounds, and sitting in a castle with Teclis there, being like, okay, cool, I'm going to put down a rune of petrification. And I was doing it in a position that, okay, I know you want to walk here. I know you want to come up through this area, and because this thing has its ability at the start and end of the movement phase, even if on the first turn I don't get the start of the movement phase, I get the end. As I was thinking before, I'm fairly certain this thing actually does affect charge rolls. So on a 4-up, they take D3 mortal wounds, subtract 1 from run rolls and charge rolls. Okay. So I did have it wrong. So I would, even if I wasn't going to get first turn value from it, or at least start of the movement phase, they would get a -1 to run rolls and charge rolls, advanced rolls for my 40k peeps. Now, -1 to charge is actually really, really nice against a lot of different armies. As well as start and end of movement phase, they roll a D6, and on a 4-up, they take D3 mortal wounds. That isn't something that a lot of people want to be like, yeah, cool, I'll go around that. Because it's also a 6-inch bubble around, let me get the model, a 6-inch bubble around this, around that base. So really, you're able to block out not just 12 inches either side, but the length of the base as well. So you're getting probably about, 15 and a half inches out of this model if you put it sideways. Blocking out that much of a piece of the board and make it so you're either, giving them a bad choice or whatever else, that can be pretty nasty. So what we're really doing to win games is getting a lot of uninteractivity in order to do what Tau does, which is kill all your stuff and then I will start scoring. If I'm alive and you're not, I can score whatever I want. Now, I did find that during my games, there were a lot of times, because you pick battle tactics differently to how we've got it. Now, I am a massive fan of the tactical secondary system within 10th edition 40k. In AOS, there is a list that you've got, as well as a list from the General's Handbook, which is basically their tournament pack. That is their GT mission pack. You select it each turn, so you kind of know what you're opting into, the state of the board, all that sort of stuff. It does make for some really, really good decision making. It makes for less reactive play, like what we've got in 10th. And I won't say that one is better than the other, but I did find that there was sort of a flow that I was getting into, where I knew kind of what my early battle tactics would be, and then leaving certain ones for later in the game because they were either very easy to achieve because my opponent wouldn't be there anymore, or they were just super easy to achieve even if I was losing. One that sticks out to my mind is there is one that the Lumineth can have, which is like have 2 endless spells on the board at once, and I was taking 3 endless spells in my list, which is like Umbral Spell Portal and Rune of Petrification, which I wanted to have there all the time. Done. Easy. And because a lot of my units can cast, I had Sonari units that cast automatically once per battle on a 9, and they would just go, cool, that's up, you've got to roll higher than a 9. And that can be a difficult process for people to do. That means that usually, even if they're in range with a deny, it's a hard process for them to deny. So I've found so much that as I am getting into this army, and I am going to stick with it, it's not going to be my main focus, but AOS is relatively fun. It scratches that fantasy itch. And I mean, worst case scenario, if this just isn't cutting it and I get into fantasy or something, then I have something for trade or to sell secondhand in order to get that fantasy army that I was never allowed to have as a kid. But I'm noticing that I have just essentially, without meaning to, gone on to Fantasy Tau. Now, their lore is different, and their lore is actually genuinely pretty interesting. One of the things I was reading about, and it's been a while, but essentially they went to either kill or imprison Slanesh, and I think they were successful for a little bit. But, you know, lore differences aside, which you would expect from a different system, I just found it really funny that the parallels that I was drawing onto this faction. And if anyone's an AOS fan or an LRL fan, I may look at making some videos, either documenting once I actually get to a tournament, or just little learnings that I've had here and there, or just little combos from the book that I've been noticing that I may want to try out. Even though I know that most of the competitive players in the AOS scene have kind of solved the army, I've also noticed that as they have been nerfed, and they've been nerfed a couple of times, same thing that happens in 40k, the meta chaser players jump off it, the faction representation goes off a cliff, and then all you've got left are really the diehard LRL fans that are playing it as a main faction, which I think is cool. So I'm going to see what we've got there, but it will be difficult, I think, because the book is just woefully unsynergistic between certain units. There are things that work, there are things that don't, but it doesn't feel as cohesive as I think I have been used to from 9th edition Tau, but I mean, this is the kindred spirit of the 10th index. Seriously. But anyway, that's my random ass ramblings for this video. To anybody that's been waiting for the Piranha and the Tetra videos, that will be coming out very, very shortly. I have just been missing a camera person for a little bit, which, I mean, if you're in Sydney and you got nothing to do, then, hey, hit a brother up. But, yeah, AOS looks like a relatively fun game. I'm keen to give it a little bit. So, yeah, catch you in the next one.